Try this for a second. Think of the last thing you made that you were genuinely proud of before you showed it to anyone. Not after the comments came in. Not after someone said it was good. Before that. There's a version of that piece that existed for maybe an hour or a day in a state of total privacy, and it's very possible that version was better than whatever you ended up publishing. Because the version you published had already been quietly negotiated with an imagined audience sitting somewhere in your head. That imagined audience is the whole subject of this essay. Almost nobody escapes it entirely, but every so often, someone manages to shut the door on it for long enough that the work does something it couldn't have done otherwise. And one of the strangest, most instructive examples of that is a painter most people have never heard of. In 1967, at the exact moment her career was taking off, Agnes Martin got in a pickup truck and disappeared. She'd spent a decade in a studio loft on Coenties Slip in Manhattan, painting alongside Ellsworth Kelly and Robert Indiana, getting shown by the gallerists who represented Rothko. Her grid paintings had made her one of the most respected abstract painters of her generation. And then, with almost no warning, she left. She drove around the country in a camper, ended up on a mesa in New Mexico, with no electricity and no phone, and didn't paint again for 7 years. When she came back to it, the grids were gone. What replaced them were soft, horizontal bands of color that she'd later describe as being about happiness, about a world without objects, about merging. She spent the next 3 decades making some of the most quietly radical work of the 20th century, from a house with no plumbing, mostly alone, mostly unbothered by anyone's opinion of it. She once said the worst thing you could think about while working was yourself, meaning your reputation, your reception, the room full of people deciding what they thought of you. Get rid of that, she believed, and the actual work reveals itself one step at a time. I keep coming back to that story because it isn't really a story about running away. It's a story about what became available to her the moment she stopped painting toward a room full of judges. The room is always there, even when it's empty. Here's the uncomfortable part. You don't have to be famous or even shown anywhere for the room to exist. The room is just a part of your mind that's tracking how the work will land before you've even finished making it. Psychologist Teresa Amabile spent decades studying this, and one of her most cited experiments is almost embarrassingly simple. She had art experts evaluate work from 29 professional artists without telling the experts that each artist had submitted both commissioned pieces and pieces made with no client, no brief, no one waiting on the other end. The experts, working blind, rated the non-commissioned work as significantly more creative, consistently, across the board. The only variable was whether someone was going to be pleased or disappointed by it. Amabile spent the following years running lab experiments trying to find reliable ways to kill creativity, and she found several. Tell people their work will be evaluated. Tell them they're competing with someone else. Put a reward on the other side of finishing. Every one of those conditions measurably narrowed what people were willing to try, because every one of them turns the work into a means of getting a reaction instead of an end in itself. She called the underlying idea the intrinsic motivation principle. People are most creative when they're doing the work because the work itself is interesting to them, not because of what it will earn them once it's done. That's a strange thing to sit with if you make things for an audience, or hope to. It suggests that the exact moment you start caring what a viewer, a reader, an algorithm, or a parent thinks of the piece, some of your actual range quietly closes. Not because caring about people is bad, because anticipating their verdict while you're still building the thing changes what the thing is allowed to be. Approval seeking doesn't just risk a bad outcome, it narrows the field of possible outcomes. This is the part that took me the longest to understand. I used to think approval seeking was mainly a confidence problem, that if I could just toughen up and not care so much what people thought, I'd make the same work, minus the anxiety. But that's not what the research says, and it's not what Martin's own account of her process says either. Martin talked about ego and pride as if they were physically in the way of the work, not just emotionally uncomfortable. I thought me, and I suffered. And the work suffered, and for that I suffered more, she once wrote. Notice the order there. The self-consciousness doesn't just make the process painful, it degrades the output. When you're mentally rehearsing how something will be received, You're not fully occupying the actual decision in front of you. This color, this word, this cut. You're occupying a simulation of a future stranger's face. Half your attention is already gone before you've made the choice. Amabile's later work backs this up with more nuance than the simple external reward kills creativity version people usually repeat. She found that not all extrinsic motivation is corrosive. Feedback that's genuinely informational, the kind that tells you something true about your own competence, can actually work alongside intrinsic motivation rather than against it. What kills the work specifically is the controlling kind. Deadlines used as pressure, evaluation used as a threat, comparison used to rank you against someone else. In other words, it's not that other people's opinions are poison. It's that bracing for judgment while you're still in the act of making is a different mental state than making. And you can't fully occupy both at once. What actually shows up when the room empties out? I notice this most clearly in my own drafts, actually. There's a specific sentence I can usually spot on a second read. The one that sounds like it's trying to be quoted or admired or forwarded to someone. It's rarely the truest sentence in the piece. It's the one I wrote with half my attention on how it would land instead of on what I actually meant. And it almost always gets cut in revision because it's doing a job the rest of the writing wasn't hired to do. The paragraphs I trust most, looking back, are the ones I wrote too fast to think about anyone reading them. I only recognize which ones those are afterward. In the moment, they don't feel brave or radical. They just feel like the only thing I could have written. So what happens to the work itself concretely when someone stops making for approval? Usually it gets stranger before it gets better. Martin's post-desert paintings confused people who wanted more of the grids that had made her name. The work that later became iconic, those pale, trembling horizontal bands, wasn't a crowd-pleasing evolution of her earlier success. It was a fairly hard pivot into something more personal and considerably less legible as a next logical step. That's usually what unsupervised work looks like at first. Less impressive by the previous standard because it's no longer optimizing for the previous standard. It also tends to slow down in a way that looks like stalling but isn't. Martin didn't paint for 7 years. Amabile's subjects, freed from deadlines and rankings, weren't necessarily faster. They were more exploratory, willing to sit with an idea that wasn't resolving yet instead of forcing it towards something presentable. Approval seeking has a bias toward the legible and the finishable, because unfinished, illegible things are hard to be praised for. Take away the need for praise and you get permission to stay in the unresolved part longer, which is usually where the actual discovery happens, and it gets more idiosyncratic. Martin's late work is full of small personal touches, sentimental titles like "I Love the Whole World" stapled onto some of the most austere, restrained canvases of the century, a combination that made no sense as a marketing decision and total sense as a human one. When you're not calibrating for a reaction, the odd, specific, slightly embarrassing true thing gets to stay in the piece instead of getting sanded off in the direction of what usually works. And the room doesn't have to be empty forever. I don't think the lesson here is that everyone should move to a mesa. Martin herself came back into the world eventually, showed her work again, gave lectures, had an active social life in her 80s. The desert wasn't a permanent renunciation of an audience. It was a stretch of time long enough for her instincts to stop reflexively orbiting other people's expectations, so that when she did return, what she brought back was actually hers. That might be the more useful version of this for the rest of us, since most of us don't have the option of 7 years and no electricity. You don't need to disappear. You need sometimes for the length of a single draft or a single canvas to close the door on the room where the verdict happens. Make the decision that's actually in front of you and let the reaction be a separate event that happens later, to a finished thing, instead of a live vote happening inside your head while you work. The work gets to be fully itself first. The room can come back in after.